Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My wife and I traveled 28 hours from Manila to be here with you in this Congress, and it's a great joy to be here. The question before us is, can you have democracy and human rights without God? The truth is self-evident, so the question answers itself. Nevertheless, we must talk about it. We live in an age of belief and unbelief. The war of religions is over. The war against religion is on. Our faith in the triune God is growing, but so also is its antithesis, atheism, agnosticism, and apostasy. Our certain hope, though, is that faith, our Christian faith, shall ultimately prevail. None of us, I believe, are living in any country where political authority reaches for a gun whenever someone speaks of reason and faith. But many of us, I fear, are living in countries where every kind of public discourse is permitted or even applauded, so long as one does not speak of God or use the language of religion. Such countries like to call themselves democratic, and they invoke human rights to justify acts and omissions that paradoxically offend and deny our intrinsic human nature. But are they true democracies? Are the human rights they speak of legitimate human rights, when in the most tragic cases they seek to repudiate the very truth of our being? What happens when a great country, which was built under a sacred canopy, with religion as its first political institution according to one of its greatest champions, a country which has inspired so many other countries to adopt a democratic constitution, not only proclaims the destruction of the unborn as a human right, but also promotes such right as a legal norm for all nations? What happens when a great continent like Europe, which once stood as the shining glory of Christianity, and through which a poor and distant country like the Philippines received its Catholic Christian faith, allows itself to be divided on the issue of whether or not to mention God and the Christian origin of its culture in its constitution? And what happens when agencies of the United Nations, which was established to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, pursue the exact opposite of its declared objective and wage war on the unborn, the family and marriage, and compel poor and powerless countries to enact laws that would undermine their basic human values and institutions? Let us for a moment look at these great Western democracies, those great champions of political liberty and human rights, still the most developed economies in the world despite the unrelieved global economic turbulence. They still seem to have done better than many God-fearing but poor countries, even if they have not had to concede to God any role at all in their economic development and progress. Is that not perhaps proof that acknowledging God's existence and God's role in the affairs of men has become totally incompatible with scientific and material progress? Does it not validate the wisdom of excluding God from public life or the public square? This is what we often hear today. Yet material progress, like poverty, has many causes. Whether for the individual or for the nation, material progress has never been and can never be the full equivalent and complete measure of true progress. On the other hand, faith in God and moral probity and rectitude have never been known to inflict poverty upon an individual or a nation, or cause a man or a woman the loss of his or her inner worth. Most of us know democracy as a complex of rules by means of which the majority for one chooses nations' leaders in periodic elections. For as long as this is so, we could probably permit ourselves to say, without committing any heresy, that the electoral majority, rather than God, is in charge there. It is no more than a political process after all. But the moment the state accepts and begins to exercise its mandate to govern, the moment it begins to enact and enforce laws, it will have to accept the authority of a transcendental power, from whom the truth about man, about freedom, about justice, about peace comes. There is only one name for that power, and that name is God. For it's no less true today than it was yesterday that civil government is nothing but a human participation in the divine governance of the universe. God remains the ultimate measure of all things. For the believing Christian, this means the God of his or her Christian faith. But for the non-believing, who may yet be tempted to act as if he or she believed, it could be, to borrow Marcelo Pera's irresistible formulation, a God who does not have a defined face, who does not have dogmas that cannot be improved, who does not have revelations that cannot be revised, who does not have interpreters against whose word no appeal is possible, who does not have specific professions of faith, who does not have exclusive rights. This is the God of his conscience, the God who makes him aware of his finitude and his wretchedness, but also of his greatness, the God who makes him a moral agent, the God who mysteriously punishes him and approves of him, the God of his anguish and his exaltation. Human rights are rights that pertain to man as man. They are not created by legislation or judicial fiat. They flow directly from man's nature as a creature of God. Not a single human right can exist without God or away from God. Thus, there is no human right, and that there can be no human right to abortion, despite Roe v. Wade or any pro-abortion legislation anywhere in the world. And there is no international human right to abortion, as we proclaim in the San Jose Articles, not because there is no international document creating such a right, but rather because there can never be any valid international document creating such a right. Pope Benedict XVI reminds us that there are things that are always wrong and can never be legalized, just as there are things that are always absolutely legally binding, things that precede every majority decision, things that majority decisions must respect. Expelling God from the public square for any reason whatsoever is the gravest wrong of all. This has been the tragedy of the first world, especially among the once Christian countries. This is the crisis to which the whole of humanity must fully and vigorously respond. We must bring God back to the heart of our families, our respective societies, and the world at large. And this is a millennial challenge. Many years ago, when I was a much younger member of the Senate, I came to Strasbourg and then to Bonn to meet with members of the European Parliament. With me were parliamentary colleagues from Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. In Strasbourg, a French member of the European Parliament with a family name that once graced Élysée Palace reproached me for coming from a poor Catholic country with a large population and with couples who need not want to offend God by limiting the number of their children they could feed and educate. I told my distinguished host that the average size of the Filipino family at the time had shrunk to 5, 3 children to 2 parents. Mine, I said, was among the last remaining large families. My wife and I had 5. The number had since grown to 7, 4 married, 3 with 8 children of their own. I could not help but add that in Paris, I was told that I could not get a decent café noir at any bistro unless I spoke Arabic. This only meant, I said, that my friend had a more serious problem than I. And this was long before we started talking of the demographic winter. We in the Philippines still produce Filipinos, while many parts of Europe could only count on migrants. In Bonn, we were lectured by our German hosts on the environment and human rights. We were put to task for breeding too many Asians who denuded our forests and polluted our air and waterways, and for adopting double standards in human rights. It was rather heavy stuff. Asked to speak for our group, I thanked our hosts for their concern and told them how much we admired their success in cleaning up their great rivers, the Thames, the Seine, the Rhine, and the Danube. I assured them our countries would try to do the same and replant our forests as soon as we had the means, maybe with help from these rich countries that had raped our forests. And I assured them that there was no such thing as an Asian double standard of human rights. It was merely hype in the press. But perhaps they might, I said, want to consider how strongly some people denounced genital mutilation among some African tribes, while calmly and routinely mutilating their unborn babies. The real name for it was infanticide. Our host suddenly looked much smaller and gentler than before, as they began to inquire about our accommodations and personal comfort. That was many years ago. In the Philippines today, we are fighting a well-funded foreign-directed reproductive health campaign, allegedly in the name of democracy, human rights, and progress, to impose birth control as an essential requirement and component of marriage. It is unconstitutional and uncalled for. For our birth rate has been declining, and no law prohibits contraception or sterilization. But it's a measure that seeks to destroy the institution of marriage and the natural family, and turn our constitutional democracy into a totalitarian state. And yet, not a few foreign governments are funding it. The rhetoric has grown increasingly shrill, and the focus of attack from outside the country and within it is not just on the church, but on God Himself. We are determined to stop the onslaught, and we are confident we shall prevail. For God never loses any battles, and we're prepared to give everything of ourselves in this fight, in the name of our democracy, in the name of our fundamental human rights, but above all, in the name of our faith. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.